For those of you who don't know us, so at PDM, we're primarily a design and innovation consultancy. Been around 20 years now, and probably 90% of what we do is in medtech. Very much a multidisciplined team. So I head up the sustainability front, but we've got a team of designers. So we get involved in things, anything from kind of user insight stuff through to more technical designing, manufacturing, that end of the scale as well. Over the last sort of 18 months, 2 years, we've had a particular focus on what we've called the Innovate to Zero. So all about using design and innovation, aligning it to net zero, helping organizations on that journey. We're very connected, obviously, in this space, as you do. And as Ryan was just mentioning as well, like there's so much going on in this space, so many organizations, so many networks, you just kind of fall down a bit of a rabbit hole of contacts upon contacts. But it is a very connected space, and we're involved with a lot of organizations, primarily the likes of the ABHI and the NIHR. And more recently, I've been involved with the Department of Health and Social Care on their Design for Life program as well. I don't know if you know BioNow, they are a life sciences network up in the north of England. We were just awarded the technical services for our sustainability work. So that was a great piece of recognition at the start of the year. Just to touch on my background, I'm an industrial designer, but then I moved very quickly into product management. So I've been a product manager working in the bicycle industry and then doing product development in outdoor apparel. So when Ryan was talking about down or feathers and duck down, things like that, I'm familiar with that from puffer jackets and sleeping bags and things like that. It's a very cool space. So as industries, both outdoor apparel and slightly less so the bike industry, although they are improving, I kind of looked on them as sort of comparators to HealthTech, having been in that space, to see kind of compare and contrast the different journeys and stages. And certainly outdoor apparel, with the likes of Patagonia being in that space, kind of international pinups for a sustainable, ethical business. As competitors within that space, you had to have a sustainability message, otherwise you were kind of dead in the water. And that led to a very rapid growth of an adoption of more sustainable materials, lots of organizations going for B Corp, really a rapid journey happening in that space. And it was really cool to see innovative materials coming through, such as Bloom, which was an algae being used to make an EVA foam replacement. Don't know if you're using EVA foams, Sam, but they might be. These kind of new materials are coming to the market all the time. And outside of medtech, they can get adopted really quickly. So what's happening in the health tech space? Well, the sustainability agenda has really been prevalent and brought to the fore, certainly in the last 4 or 5 years. This kind of graphic, this art piece, if you like, illustrates the impact of single-use devices in particular. Obviously, surgery is one of the most carbon-intensive areas of healthcare, and a lot of that has come about through the adoption of single-use. Really off the back of mad cow disease, everything went to single use in like the 90s. And since then, we're just, that take, make, waste situation is really becoming a problem and very expensive for the NHS in terms of waste management, incineration, and is causing them a lot of emissions. So the landscape's moving quickly. Requirements are kind of dropping in left, right, and centre. And there's an increased weighting on sustainability and increased interest for it. You'll see it in tenders. But it has kind of taken some of the industry by surprise. The larger corporates were already on this journey because they had to do corporate carbon accounting, things like that, as listed companies. But for the SMEs in particular, they were kind of blindsided by a lot of this. And you can imagine picking up a conversation about scope 1, 2, and 3, GHG emissions. It's a whole other language, right? And we're just trying to wrap our heads around all the regulatory changes that were happening in the medical space. So it really came as a bit of a bolt from the blue. So there was this period of literacy building to begin with. The NHS were being really good at telling you kind of what you needed to do, but not much of the how to go about doing it. which is kind of where we stepped in. So over the last few years, there's been a phenomenal amount of work, research, reports being released, initiatives in play, organizations popping up and growing, all in and around sustainable healthcare. So any one of these is well worth a look, just for a bit of background. But the few of the primary ones I'd pick out there is obviously the net zero roadmap for suppliers by the NHS. And then things like the Design for Life and the Green Surgery Report are also pretty key documents that have come out recently. So if you're supplying the NHS, Sam, you might have come across this. You're nodding, yeah.
Is this an evergreen assessment?
Kind of, yeah.
On net zero milestone.
Yeah, it touches on it kind of relates to the evergreen. Yeah, I'll come to that. So this was yeah, a lot of people kind of smiling and crying as they got to the evergreen assessment. So these kind of the roadmap that the NHS set out, currently the majority of contracts will require a carbon reduction plan. So that's looking at your corporate emissions sort of at a top level as an organization. In 2027, this gets expanded into global emissions and all of scope 3. And then in 2028, they're really interested in product carbon footprinting as well. So trying to understand, and this might be, your place to shine, Ryan, if you're using recycled material in effect through your product carbon footprint, you'd be able to illustrate your lower carbon offering there. It isn't just the NHS. Obviously, if we can open our product to new markets, we should be. And these kind of requirements, this level of structure is kind of being mirrored now in about 80 different healthcare markets worldwide. So some organizations might think, well, I can, scrap the NHS. It's only 4% of my revenue. I'll double down on California or whatever. Well, this is increasingly being adopted worldwide. So it's really only a case of a matter of time. So in between those milestones, we have seen things starting to ramp up. This is a selection of tender questions, one from NHS Scotland, another one from a UK tender. Again, both talking about what are you doing in terms of your product design, what are you doing in terms of your manufacturing emissions. So all kinds of kind of probing questions, if you like, in and around this space. And I think it sounds like both of you have already got a bit of an angle or a route in which to kind of respond to those questions, which is great. So currently, if you were to specifically look at the NHS and making sure your requirement with them, it's the carbon reduction plan being the principal one at the moment, which, Sam, you probably saw that referenced in the evergreen assessment if you were looking at that. Yeah, so that is a self-assessed exercise. It has been adopted by the devolved nations as well. So if you're applying for tenders in Scotland, Wales, etc., they're sharing those scores. Most organizations, I think, are a 1, 0 or a 1. Very few are in the 3s and 4s at the moment. So it's basically a maturity score. It's explaining to the NHS how you as an organization, how mature you are on that sustainability journey. The social value weighting, also really important, 10% weighting at tenders at the moment, and that may well change and vary from one tender to the next, but it's in and around that at the moment. I think it's a minimum of 10%. And then modern slavery. You were just talking about your supply chain, Sam, and being China free. That's really interesting to hear. But
it was really funny doing the modern slavery assessment because our supply chain is really small and quite on purpose. We've designed it that way because we've always been quite concerned about our impact, and that's what we wanted to do. And of course, within our organization, we do a lot of stuff all ourselves. So the modern slavery assessment was hilarious trying to do that, really, because it was so much of it was quite irrelevant. So we had to go through them, and we were getting scores, and the same with our evergreen. We were getting scores where the system was going, well, you couldn't possibly get this, and we were like, well, we are, because we're tiny and we're in charge of every little bit of what we do, So Yeah, it
that's
was quite
brilliant.
an interesting process.
That's brilliant. And then the next one to watch, and this would be a great one for you as well, Ryan, is the circularity, that there is increasing focus on circularity. So reusing materials where possible is really going to become of interest. So there's the kind of the push, if you like, from the NHS and their regulations, requirements in order to compete in a tender. But then there's also the pull, and the pull from the clinicians has been quite prevalent as well. I think this green surgery report from the Royal College of Surgeons was a great example. In their recommendations for industry, they were consistently picking up on things to do with circular economy, designing products with modularity for long life, using maximal recycled content, etc., etc. So very much, I think it sounds like the both of you have got already some good ideas about how you could align to those. In the kind of the corporate world, the incumbents, the big global med techs, the PLCs, obviously they are responding to this. They do see the shifting in the market. We're working with a couple of them, but they're big ships that are slow to pivot. So there is an opportunity in the meantime whilst that's happening. Primarily, they've been focusing on this decarbonising, particularly their production activities, supply chain, things like that. Those quick returns on investment, trying to boost their kind of margin to then invest into things like a net zero offering. And this kind of lateral move into neighbouring value pools, if you like, is an interesting one. That might be more circular solutions, such as moving into remanufacturing of devices. So if you're already manufacturing new devices, could you begin remanufacturing, as in refurbishing, recertifying, re-sterilizing, putting back into the market? And kind of more broadly, this was a great little stat from the recent PwC report from CEOs. Almost half of them don't think their business would be viable in the next 10 years. Really a state of where things are heading and the need for these large organizations to pivot. And the little bar chart down at the bottom there, those already innovating on new climate friendly products, over half of them at this stage. So they see the landscape moving and they are shifting. So this is a great time to be a startup because the landscape's moving quickly. You can respond and adapt and be in a really solid position. So your agility is a huge advantage at this stage, particularly with, like I said, how slow it is for the incumbents to move. So capturing some of that market and that demand right out of the gate. Particularly with medical devices, there's huge costs involved if you need to put them through any amount of regulations. So building the product right first time, embedding sustainability up front means once you reach the market, you won't be looking to redevelop it and try and lower the carbon footprint, very early on in your journey. You want to start selling right after that. You want to make sales. So building in this competitive edge, you can come into the market, disrupt things, kind of steal the march on your competition with that more sustainable offering. Circularity, as I said, being an absolute key one. And there's opportunities such as product as a service. So, for example, your packaging, could it be renewable? Could it be provided as a service rather than purchasing individual items? This concept of building a stable revenue rather relying on sales cycles. And of course, opening yourselves up to more increased funding success, be that with the likes of SBRI, Innovate UK's, NIHR's, etc., but also from private investment as well. If you've got a really strong sustainability message, you definitely attract more investment that way. The only way investment organizations can decrease their carbon footprint is to invest into more sustainable businesses. So having that really at your core puts you in a very strong position. And ultimately having this authentic message that you are a sustainable organization. This isn't a bit of greenwashing, a bit of fluff that you put on the end. You actually have something that holds water. I really like this quote. I need to find the reference from where it came, but I think it sums everything up nicely. Those who integrate sustainability from the start are more resilient and better prepared. in terms of future policy changes and market expectations. So very much something to have in the back of your mind. I'll kind of skip through this because I think you guys don't need much convincing. This is more one for the CEOs who don't get it. What we're talking about here is if you're off on the left-hand side with very low motivation, you're not really going to be doing more than towing the line, meeting requirements, and only responding to risks and regulations. You're not really on the more of the right-hand side where you're looking at the opportunities, and in particular, building revenue and reputation off the back of sustainability. Are you guys familiar with scope 1, 2, and 3? Sam's nodding away. Were you a year ago? No.
No, I can't remember when we had to put our tender. No, it might have been just over a year, 18 months ago. I had to look into it because I had to do the tender documents. I'd never done an NHS tender before, and I just sort of made it up as I went along. It was fine. It was fine.
Okay, good. Have you come across scope 1, 2, and 3, Ryan? Is this familiar to you?
Right. Yeah. I've got some I won't go into it now, but some thoughts and comments on specifically on what we do is lots of talk, as you say, of the corporates on bringing these numbers down, but you get to the nitty-gritty sharp end of the stick, and logistics and procurement need to know that it works and costs the right amount first, and it feels like these things come in second. So it's interesting how different the story breaks down depending on where you're speaking in the organization.
Yes,
yeah, I agree with that, absolutely. And then there's the spread and adoption thing where people just don't like change, so we have to have that in mind too.
Yeah, there are many barriers to entry without doubt, but I suppose this is about having your ducks in a row and being able to respond no matter which stakeholder you're speaking to. So in terms of scope 1, 2, and 3, it's going to become increasingly common. I think this is almost what a P&L or balance sheet and cash flow, that what those terms are to accounting. Scope 1, 2, and 3, it's the equivalent for carbon accounting. So the best way to remember them is with the 3 Bs. So scope 1 being anything you burn. So think of emissions from your company vehicles. If you have an office, your gas boiler, it has an exhaust pipe, you're releasing emissions directly. Scope 2 being anything you buy. So you'll typically be buying your electricity from a supplier such as Octopus. There are emissions associated to that electricity being generated. So that's where you account for that within your scope 2. And scope 3 is everything beyond, and that breaks down into upstream of you. So things like the materials you might be using in your product, the supply chains and the logistics of those. You can't influence if your supplier is using renewable fleet of vehicles for their logistics, but as they decarbonize, it will reduce your emissions as well. And the same goes for downstream. So what happens with your product at like the end of life? How is that handled? Is it incinerated? Is it ground up and recycled? Is it, entirely circular? You recover it and make it into a new product? Don't know, but that's very quickly kind of what scope 1, 2, and 3 cover. As we're categorizing emissions into these, at the moment, the NHS are just looking at these 5 in blue. They're kind of the easier ones to capture the data for and report on. But the big one they're missing at the moment is purchased goods and services. So if you're manufacturing products, if you're producing things, your emissions will most likely be weighted towards this category. So scope 3, category 1, purchased goods and services. So with that bit of background, our approach to this kind of breaks down into these 3 different phases: plan to zero, innovate to zero, and design to zero. So planning is very much about getting your ducks in a row in terms of meeting requirements. So things like your carbon reduction plan, making sure that you've got your carbon accounting in place, your reduction plans published and online so that you're compliant for tenders. If you're on kind of pre-revenue or still in this kind of scale-up phase, we also work with companies in that kind of phase who are trying to embed sustainability. And in particular, this is as you're making decisions, entering new contracts, things, you're kind of setting yourself up for the next few years. So having the more sustainable route within each of these areas, so be it your facilities, the product itself, the travel, logistics, all these things, there may be more sustainable avenues you could go down, you know, right out of the gate before you get kind of too far and too ingrained in lots of different contracts and things. In terms of the carbon reduction plans, how they typically break down as we do the carbon accounting, we see meeting current NHS requirements, which was those 5 categories of scope 3 I mentioned earlier. We see a pie chart roughly like this, with those direct emissions, scope 1 and 2, just making up about 25%. When we add in that big category I mentioned, purchased goods and services, i.e. everything product related, that scope 3 jumps to more like 95%. How we see that break down, it's a region of 70% coming from that purchased goods and services piece. On top of that, logistics can be quite significant, especially if you've got a big supply chain, sourcing things from Far East, etc. And then the typical business activities like travel, commuting, things like waste and end of life tend to make up a smaller proportion. It depends on your products and how that's handled. When you go through this exercise, the number one thing which becomes apparent is that costs equal carbon. So carbon accounting is essentially applying emissions to every pound you spend. So for £100 spent on energy, that'll create a certain amount of emissions. So if you can reduce your spend, you can reduce your carbon at the same time. As we move into the innovate phase, this is where we usually do kind of a multi-stakeholder workshop activity where we're trying to focus in on that 70% of emissions coming from the product. The multi-stakeholder piece is important because sustainability touches lots of different stakeholders, both inside and outside an organization. So if you've got key suppliers, be it your materials, be it logistics, whatever it happens to be, getting them involved in this activity can be really crucial to making much bigger breakthroughs than you could achieve on your own. So risks and challenges is kind of a great place to start, looking at what those are for you and your business and the products you're trying to launch. And then what the opportunity, how might you address that challenge? How might we, etc. To address those challenges, but it's all about trying to hit this triangle, this saving carbon, saving cost, but improving patient outcomes. So if we can deliver on all 3 of those, we're kind of really onto a winner with what we're doing. Off the back of that, we build in some prioritization through some kind of scoring matrix just to build some prioritization around it. And ultimately that forms the basis for the strategy. So what might a more sustainable product, how might we move forward with purpose and with a strategy? Some of the things we might touch on in that workshop, we talk about pulling the levers, or pull the levers to sustainable innovation. They typically fall into areas of design and those areas within your supply chain. So within design, it might be clinical or user insight. And I know, Sam, you were talking about, you were very focused on the user and getting as much information from them as you can, which is absolutely the right thing to do. How your product might influence or change the care pathway is a really important one. Some medical devices may alter or remove the need for a surgery, for instance. Well, if you've mitigated those emissions, it's what's called scope 4, avoided emissions. It's increasingly becoming a thing, but evidencing that and how you've changed that care pathway and saved those emissions is actually a really important part of your value proposition. The materials themselves, obviously there's increasing number of sustainable materials coming to market. It's just a matter of what's appropriate for your product. If you can't change the material, which for some devices it's very difficult to, you could look to just use less. So try lightweighting as kind of a classic engineering trick. Try and strip some of the weight out. Try to standardize some of the internals, sharing, some of those key components that sit inside a device. Could you share them across a wider product portfolio? And even down to the packaging. So absolutely in Ryan's sweet spot, this was what you're focused on. The opportunities within the packaging space are really prominent, and it's actually a place that a lot of organizations look to start because it has a lower regulatory burden for them. It's much easier to change your packaging than it is to go through the device changes itself. Over on the supply chain side, so being conscious of things like space optimization. So how might your device, I don't know, collapse or tessellate or something in order to minimize its space in shipping? How might that relate to things like sterilization? Could you get more of them on a pallet for sterilization, that kind of thing? Making sure that within the supply chain, you're not using any air freight, really avoiding air freight wherever you can is really important. We've really moved into a new kind of era of advanced manufacturing, things like additive manufacturing, automation, etc. There's new, more efficient ways of producing things that didn't exist 10, 20 years ago. Leveraging those, again, to bring down your supply chain, perhaps operate on a leaner, more just-in-time model or made to order, those kind of things. Obviously reduce stock holdings, save carbon and save cost. But the junction of these two really sits this linear to circular transition. So kind of meeting this circular economy will require working with your supply chain, but also the design itself needed to be built for a circular economy to begin with. I might stop there. Then my presentation then goes on into a bit more about circular design and our approach. Were there any questions come up just from where we've got to? I kind of don't like to launch in a monologue and be speaking for 45 minutes straight, boring you to death. Any thoughts immediately jump to mind, or?
Sam, you want to go first?
Yeah, I was just going to say that I think the main thing to remember when you're looking at all of this is it needs to be really proportionate to what you do and how you are as a startup or an SME, and actually, it's like some of the language that you have to unpick to work your way through some of this is pretty tricky, like you were touching on there. And it does take a little bit of understanding, but there is, when we went through our tender process, it was just, there was so much of it that was just absolutely such a ridiculous thing to ask a team of 3 people, and you just think, what? But you still got to find a way to navigate through that because you don't have an option not to. Luckily, there are some hacks with some of this as well, particularly working with the NHS. So if the NHS really want you, they will do what they can to get you on that. One of the things we were told, for example, was if you're struggling with the tender process, once the tender was open, they could give me the framework manager gave me one-to-one support for about a year before the tender even opened because they were desperate for us to be on there. And then when it opened, there was so much shit she didn't tell me because she just thought I would know and I just didn't. That when it actually opened and I could see what I had to do, I just couldn't get anywhere with it. And a lady from NHS Wales said to me, well, we're NHS Wales and the tender system is basically the same and the documents you have to do is basically the same. But because I'm in Wales, nobody in England can give you any mentorship or help anymore because it's live. But we can because we're in Wales. So,
Yeah.
And you can fight if they want you bad enough, and they do realize internally how difficult some of these things are to navigate, how difficult the language is and how hard it is as a very small company coming into it. And I think that's kind of important to remember. I don't think they're trying on purpose. That it's really stupid and awkward sometimes, but I don't think they mean it to be that way, do they?
Yeah, no, that's it. It's a challenge of standardized processes, right? It's it's very difficult for them to have a standard process for those global corporates who've got vast supply chains and, you know, don't even have a clue where some of the subcomponents even come from. You know, it's such a different story. How about for you, Ryan? Was there some stuff in there that was kind of new use, things to be on the radar?
No, a lot to unpack, because I think that I don't even know where to start. Let's start at what we're trying to do, right?
Yeah.
We're trying to make sure that in general, we are building more sustainable lives for ourselves, so the planet doesn't go to crap.
Yeah.
And we all interact with economies and corporates and businesses, and we think that the best way of doing that, you have to measure it to be able to know what's happening. And I totally get that. My background's in biology, and one of the things that always is really amazing to me is how complex the natural world is, right? And simple diagrams do not exist. Like you just move one thing one way, a million other things happen, and that is exactly what's replicated in the complexity of everyday life and supply chains. So we have to measure it. We have to do it. There's no way of just shrugging your shoulders and doing it. But I think what is the reality and the challenge, and even looking at your diagram there, is that we will set up frameworks that say these numbers go down, so that's better. And I always sort of think, and I can see it, that if you decide, as you've sort of alluded to, drop in scope 4 and everything changes.
Yeah.
Drop in risk management from, I don't know, as you sort of say, like how, let's even do an example of the surgery, you know, great, we're averting surgeries, drops carbon massively. What happens if the solution you do fails 1 in 9 times, and that 9 time you have to do the surgery, and suddenly, just like the reusable cup, right? Really great, but when you don't get them back, what's the impact? And I think that naturally boundaries have to be set, because you can't do any, you cannot have everyone running from different rules. But I think it's very easy for, and maybe this is something startups can lean into, but it's very easy to set up boundaries that benefit your solution. And I think what the challenge is, how does healthcare actually come up with a set? You can't run the simulation infinitely and run it to the point of, is this actually better under every single scenario and circumstance? And I think as startups, Sam's right, we need to sort of set sensible limits. And I'm blabbering because I don't see there's no answer to it.
You're absolutely
no answer
right.
to that.
You're absolutely right. I think that setting sensible limits is such a key thing to say, because if you're trying to go through all your, as an SME, a startup with a small supply chain like ours, and then you're trying to find all these little bits of, you know, scope emissions, or you're trying to find all these little bits, there's only, you're just looking for stuff that doesn't need to be there. And you can spend, I know this, you can go down the rabbit hole, and as the MD, I don't have time to do that, so I need to do what I can do to prove. I mean, the and again, back to your point about those infinite kind of possibilities and those little changes that lead to other big changes and things. I think for us, we've been in a very particular situation where we just didn't care. We not that we didn't care. We wanted to work with the NHS, but we didn't need to, because women recognised that the NHS prosthesis they were given didn't work for them, and that's why we started. We started from the women who were wearing the products, who were rejecting what the NHS was offering and willing to pay for their own money to get something better and something more sustainable and something that they liked and functioned in the way that they wanted it to do. And actually, if what you're doing is patient-led, then the rest of the stuff will follow in the end anyway, because that's the main thing. If you're starting from people as your starting point in your human-centered design, then actually the rest of it can kind of follow. I mean, what we did was, when we looked at that product that we were looking for another solution for, we looked at all the different pain points and and the longevity of the product. There's the current market prosthesis can only last for about 2 years. When it breaks, you have to throw it away. There's no repairing, there's no saving it, there's nothing you can do with it. You can't recycle it because it's a silicone gel, it's really sticky, there's nothing you can do with it, and it just goes into landfill. And because we were starting with some of the issues that patients were having in terms of the look and feel and functionality, we could then start from that design process from day one, really, to also think about the sustainability. But it wasn't because we were looking with an eye on an NHS contract. It was because that was the right thing to do, and that's what people wanted us to do, and that's what we wanted to do. We didn't want to bring a product into the world that we didn't have a process to get rid of again, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And Rich, I think kind of similar to that point as well is, I think what can and will happen is what sustainability means in 5 to 10 years will be totally different. I just can feel that some new metric or some new way of thinking about it, and it's totally fair that if we design it in now, that's all well and good. Let's take, I mean, in our world, the example is of reuse and circularity, right? It's really important. And for the packaging we got, a lot of people, the mantra became, if you reuse your stuff, it's better for the environment. Great. And then suddenly, as I said, people just expanded that thought process one more step and said, well, yes, what happens when it's really far away and it's got to come back? What happens when some of them don't come back? What does the numbers look like? So you've spent all your time being very purposeful and purpose-led on building a circular solution, and then the rug got pulled out under you, and the meaning of what was sustainable changed, and it will be a problem. So yeah, I think that limits are good. I do think that, again, no real good answer to this, but the challenge is if you set limits and unfortunately the organization you're working on has wider limits, you're a bit stuffed, because that's what they're going to want. So
yeah,
I think it is what it is. So
yeah, it's really important to know where the goalposts are.
Yeah,
because otherwise you can kind of end up, like Sam was saying, go down a rabbit hole and it won't score you any more points, unfortunately. So it is about understanding those. I mean, one that we hear quite a lot is, but my product saves a lot of water, for instance, and you can attribute carbon to that, but it's the carbon footprint is the bit that they're really interested in, because they're having to report, that's their KPI, on a carbon footprint. So by all means, you can build it into your value proposition, but this kind of carbon tunnel vision is very prevalent at the moment. But I think you're right, Ryan. It will change quickly in the next few years, and
something, I don't know what it is because we can't say yet, but something will progress. But I think look, organizations like yourselves have to help out, because I'm sure, as Sam's seen, picking this up from scratch is just like what is going on. Help is needed for sure. And I don't want to sound too pessimistic, and I know we're recording this, so you've got to watch my words, but it is an important, and I won't use the exact word tick box, but it is an exercise that we can all kick and scream that maybe this is not the way to do sustainability, but we all need an agreed set of rules, and at the moment these are the rules. So
Ryan, is the NHS surely isn't your only route to market? They're not.
No. This is a very
for you, though. Are they a main target?
Sort of yes, sort of no. Only because we make such good packaging that the actual requirements for UK logistics, we actually can go above and beyond. So there's like other products that can do a lot of UK based national deliveries. Our product's so good that others struggle to do international. So there's stuff around. Yes, of course, we are speaking to a few NHS contacts, but we are wider than that. And I think, to the point of what I was saying before about some of the corporates we're talking to, yes, they take forever. They've also got the stick up their butt, and if you get through to the right person, people can just make things happen. It might not be able to make things happen to the point of it's deployed across the organization like that, of course not, but you get through to the right person. There's maybe not quite so much bureaucracy when someone as the head of sustainability somewhere goes, yeah, we're a massive company, make this work somehow. So for us, that's still something to do. And to allude on my last point, sustainability, I think what's happened for us is, even without having to necessarily prove all of our metrics from the bat, given what we are innately, and given that a lot of the industry has suffered from the paper straw problem of a lot of sustainable solutions were nice to hear about, but when you try them, they don't work. And in this packaging, critical packaging, it's like, it must work first of all. So we're getting the first barriers that we are getting through are purely down to performance and cost. Then they will probably check us sustainability wise quite closely. But the other benefit is the other sustainable ones just can't do what we can do. So what are they comparing us against? You know, and this, what I fear, looping back round, is sometimes a tit for tat goes on, maybe between the sustainable solutions being like, our number's better than your number, therefore you win, you know, and this kind of counting stuff. But we don't seem to be encountering that too much, just because ours steps as a separate category for these corporates and non-HNS people, where they can just make the decision. So
yeah, it's a challenge, that's for sure. One bit that always rings in the back of my ears was a quote from Heidi Barnard, who's head of net zero for the NHS supply chain. She said, if your innovation, if you're adopting sustainability and it's costing more money, then you're doing something wrong. And we know that a more sustainable solution won't be adopted if it's more expensive. It's just going to be the reality of the NHS. It's cash strapped. More expensive isn't an option unless you are able to demonstrate, like we said, avoided emissions, thinking about changing pathways, being more disruptive. It sounds like your product, Ryan, could be going over and above like the baseline of offerings in that space. So what does that actually open up? The kind of the value proposition broadens, I suppose, beyond what the competition can offer.
And we call it, you know, you've got to educate them on the total cost of ownership, and there's probably total cost of carbon, right? It's the same thing. It's money and it's carbon, but sometimes it's getting people over the hump of, this is what this does as a box or a device, and then this is what this brings to your organization, you know, and someone must look down and agree, because it is kind of all arbitrary, isn't it? Once you get into the hypotheticals of my horrible toxic device saves lives and prevents surgeries. It's terrible for the planet. Yeah. Way worse than for plastics. It kills like so many things, but you'll never have to have a surgery again, and all the carbon saving for that. And people need to get their heads around that as an education piece. And I think that's can be challenging. My example was very extreme, but when it's less extreme, it gets blurry.
Well, that's great.
I've just started to think again about what Ryan was saying about how the goalposts all change, and he thinks that there's like going to be whole new ways of measuring this, and it started to like niggle at me, because one of the barriers and issues that we found with our tender is the NHS framework that we go on is not open. It only opens every 4 years, so they never get innovation and they never get chance to onboard lower carbon thing, only in a 4-year cycle. So things that happen, it's hilarious, because you know, like loads of shit can happen in 4 years and then you're like, you have to start there, and then that's kind of outdated, and it's interesting really how things change in that time.
Yeah very true.
Okay.